Ready to go? Welcome, everyone. Okay, we may as well dive straight into this. Today we're going to be talking about CO2 capture and the relevance of that capture to US companies, but not just US companies. We're also going to be talking about what's happening in the global market. Okay, so let me just get moving along a little bit. We'll do some introductions. Okay, these two reprobates, the one on the left is myself. My name is Ron Friend. I work with the Competency Alliance, which is part of the PetroSkills group. And I'm VP for Net Zero and Renewables with particular responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions. My background is I do a master's from Huddersfield University. It actually says 40 years experience in the energy industry. I'm more like Carl. I think I'm heading over 50 years. Okay. Carl, you want to introduce yourself?
Right. Hello, everyone. I'm Carl Gerdes. Within PetroSkills and the Competency Alliance, my role is the community leader of the CO2 Capture community of practice, if you will. And I'm also course director for the several-day course that we have on CO2 capture from industrial operations. Academically, I was one of those slow learners, so I have a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of California, Davis. And like Ron, I've been in the energy biz, in specifically the oil and gas industry, for a bit over 50 years. There you have it. So Ron, take it away.
All right, thanks. All right, a little bit of background about who we are. What is the Competency Alliance? We were split off from PetroSkills. Well, we're still part of PetroSkills. But for about the last 4 years, we've been working in net zero and renewables. And we've got communities. Carl's looking after the carbon capture. We have carbon sequestration community. We've got the hydrogen community. We've got the geothermal, as well as the greenhouse gas management. So the people who are actually working in this are industry leaders, and I think rightly, I think we're proud to have those people on board. For this session, we're going to be talking particularly about carbon capture, and Carl's going to get into some of the issues associated with some of the recent changes in the political spectrum, and also the potential regulatory changes. As far as TCA is concerned, the Competency Alliance, our focus is to develop a competent workforce. That's our raison d'etre. That's why we're here. So the intention is that we will develop competency assessments, competency lists, and those competencies can define what people need to be able to do when they actually come into that community, into that sector, and how can they actually do their job. And from that, we're developing training material to help fill any skill gaps. So that's where we're coming from. During this particular webinar, what we'll be doing is we will be talking about this thing about carbon capture. And if you look on your screen, up towards the top right-hand side, there's a little square box that has a question mark in it. Now, if you have any questions during the webinar, if you click on that question mark button, it should open up another pane, and then you can enter any questions, and then we'll make sure those questions, at least we'll try and get the questions answered during the session. If not, if we don't get all of the questions answered, then we will write the questions out and it will go out with the material to everyone who's attending. Okay. Now what I'll be doing is I'm going to do the intro, the first part, and I'm going to give you some background about what is this thing about, I mean, why are we doing this in the first place? Why do we even worry about carbon capture? So I'm going to be talking a little bit about global warming, greenhouse gas effect, and so on. And then I'm going to hand over to Carl for the really detailed good stuff. All right. So a little bit of background. What's all the fuss? I think you can see from here, if we just look at this map, what we're saying is over the last couple of thousand years, we're looking at the variation in global temperature. We can see, generally we were fairly steady. There have been some issues with some changes, particularly things like volcanic eruptions. But what we do see is over the last couple of hundred years, we are seeing quite a big increase in global temperature. And if we go over to look at the actual temperatures, certainly over in 2006, global temperatures above 0.6 Celsius, gradually increasing until in 2024, that's the warmest year to have been directly observed using thermometer measurements. Okay, all right, so what's the big deal about that? Right, the big deal is that there is a correlation between global temperatures and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, the graphic you can see in front of you, the blue line is the global temperature. And you can see that we were going back here about 420,000 years. And you can see from there that there are cyclic changes. And round about every 100,000 years, with some perturbations in between at about 20,000 years, we do see these regular changes. So this thing about global temperature changing is not anything particularly new. The concern is that we do have this correlation between whenever the temperature is high, we're also seeing an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So there's definitely a link. The argument that I hear from a lot of people is which comes first, the chicken or the egg, the temperature or the CO2? And it's difficult to say. However, when we look at what's happened over the last couple of hundred years, we can see what's happened. Whereas the maximum level of CO2 previously was about 300 parts per million, in the last 150, 200 years, that level has gone from about 200 parts per million up to now it's about 420 parts per million. And that's a big impact. All right, so what's the big deal? Right, the big deal here is this thing that we call the greenhouse effect. Now, the greenhouse effect is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, if we didn't have the greenhouse effect, we would be living in a ball of ice, because all the heat that would come from the sun would eventually just fly off into space. So what would normally happen is we'd get heat coming from the sun, and that heat comes down into the earth. In the normal state of affairs, this heat coming from the sun, it's got a fair high amount of energy. But the surface of the sun, don't forget, is about 5,000 degrees Celsius. So there's a lot of energy in that heat that's coming from the sun. So it's short wavelength, high frequency. But when it comes down to the earth, it warms up the earth. And instead of 5,000 degrees C, now the surface of the earth on average about 15 degrees Celsius. So some of that heat will come back and some of it will escape into space. But luckily, because we have some clouds, some of that heat hits the cloud and it warms the clouds up. So we're actually retaining some of that heat, which is nice. That's a good thing to have. The problem is, are we having too much of a good thing? And now, if we got a lot more CO2 and a lot more cloud in the atmosphere, both the CO2 and the water vapor clouds are both acting to enhance and amplify that greenhouse gas effect. So what's happening now is we've got the heat from the sun punching through the greenhouse gases, mainly CO2 and water vapor. It hits the surface of the earth, warms it up, but now not so much of this goes back into space, because now we have more greenhouse gas than we did before. So now these greenhouse gases warm up, and now a lot of that is reflected back down to Earth. Now, the current theory is that this is what's causing the rise in global temperatures. So the idea is that as we get more greenhouse gases, the greenhouse gases warm up because of the heat reflected and emitted from the Earth. The greenhouse gases warm up. Some of the heat from the greenhouse gases will go into space, but a much higher percentage is now coming back into Earth, which is heating up the air, heating up the ground. And that's what we see with this thing called global warming. Now, there are two terms there. We've got climate change and we've got global warming. And I looked at the NASA website, and NASA gives us definitions for these. And as far as NASA is concerned, climate change is natural. It's something that's been happening for millions of years. It is cyclic and it's fine. It's a long-term change to the average global weather patterns, and that's natural processes. Global warming, on the other hand, this is what's been happening recently, between 1850 and 1900. And that's anthropogenic, which means human activities. So that's a big issue. Now, what we're concerned about is we're burning a lot of fossil fuel, which emits a lot of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is our primary greenhouse gas. Okay, just a little bit about where this CO2 comes from. And if you look at CO2 emissions per energy unit, this is how many kilograms of carbon dioxide you get for every megawatt hour of energy produced. Coal 328, oil 260, natural gas 201. So what it means is, depending on what your fuel is, to get the same amount of energy, coal is going to give you a heck of a lot more carbon dioxide, a heck of a lot more greenhouse gas than the others. And certainly natural gas is a heck of a lot less than coal. So useful. We do have issues. There are other factors there. We have NOx and SOx, particulate matter, and all of them can have effects.
Say, Ron.
Yeah.
There is a question from the audience asking, is there a limit to how much heat CO2 can capture? That is, once you go above a certain limit of CO2 in the atmosphere, would it cause any further global warming, or does it just continue to build up? Which is a good question.
It's a very, very good question. And the answer is not particularly straightforward. It's not a linear relationship. And certainly, there's a lot of discussion about reaching the tipping point in CO2 concentration in the Earth's atmosphere. But what we do tend to think now is that there probably will not be an absolute tipping point. And once we get into very high CO2 concentrations, then the effect will not be linear. You will not have a runaway effect. That's pretty much what we think will happen. But you will have an effect. I can't give you an actual number to what a limit would be, because I don't think there actually is a limit to what the amount of heat the CO2 can capture. But even if we get very, very high levels, you will get an increase in temperature, and you've got to think about what the issues are going to be with those increases in temperature. And one of the big ones is going to be increase in sea level. Now, that's going to happen over a long time. We're talking about 100 years, 200 years. Once we get into some of the other factors, you've got to think about, just look what's happening at the weather patterns lately. And all that's going to happen is, as you get more and more greenhouse gas effect, or more global warming, really, that's the thing. It doesn't really matter if this global warming is caused by greenhouse gas effect or not. But as the temperature increases, you're going to see more of these weather events. And we just talked about before we came on air, Carl and myself, we were just talking about what happened in the Philippines with that super typhoon. And these are happening more and more. But I do take your point, Jeffrey. What I'll do is I'll do some digging, and I'll see what the latest is on these limits. But honestly, I don't think there is a limit. Okay. Sorry, long answer to a short question, but it's a very good question. All right, in the atmosphere, global greenhouse gas emissions by gas, CO2, about 65% is coming from fossil fuel and industrial processes. Forestry and other land use, 11%. Methane is a big greenhouse gas, about 16%. Nitrous oxide, about 6%, and then there are some others. The one that's not shown on here is the effect of water vapor. Now, the thing about water vapor in itself is not a greenhouse gas, although a lot of people will talk about it as if it is. The problem is that the water vapor in the atmosphere is an amplifier of the greenhouse gas effect. So as the CO2 develops this thing about the greenhouse gas effect, temperature increases, you get more water vapor in the atmosphere, and the water vapor itself creates the greenhouse gas effect. But we can't give it a global warming potential number because in itself it's not the greenhouse gas. It's a result of it. Okay, now, hopefully that's not confused everybody too much. But what I was trying to do here was just to set the stage to what is the reason for actually trying to capture this carbon dioxide. And now we're going to hand over to my learned colleague, Carl. And Carl's going to tell us a lot more about what's actually going on here and what's going to be happening in the US. So Carl, please take it away.
It would be helpful to turn on my microphone first.
We'll love it when you do
that. So let's take a look at recent policy changes in the US, which basically have stepped back from this whole notion of needing to convert to a net zero energy system, net zero referring to emissions of greenhouse gases. And the actions that have taken place are quite significant. The first one I've highlighted there is the US EPA is proposing to eliminate regulations limiting greenhouse gas emissions. That's the first item. Also, they're in fact further than that proposing to rescind what's called the endangerment finding. That was the finding that based on science that greenhouse gases are a hazard to human health and well-being and therefore could be regulated under the laws relating to emissions in the United States. So they're proposing to eliminate that finding and rule. And of course, the administration has been downplaying the risk of climate change. In addition, there are also tax incentives for renewable power are ending. And in fact, some projects have been stopped. There's also, by the current administration, an emphasis on energy security and fossil fuel. So these are all changes basically looking to minimize or eliminate action relating to greenhouse gas emissions in the US. But interestingly, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill that was passed earlier this year kept in place the tax credits that are available relating to CO2, so-called 45Q tax credits. And these are both for storage of CO2 and enhanced oil recovery. Further, the Big Beautiful Bill increased the tax credits available for CO2 used for EOR to the same value as available for CO2 storage, which is a maximum of $85 per ton. Also, the direct air capture credit was kept in place, which is a maximum of $180 per ton. Also relating to the net zero, of course, has been in the past, there's been a so-called 45V credit for low carbon hydrogen or green hydrogen if it's from completely renewable sources. And these credits go away for anything that is not under construction by the end of the year 2027. So those credits will be going away, but the CO2 credits remain in place, interestingly enough. So there are still drivers, enhancers that would encourage the use of CCS, carbon capture and storage, even in the US, even with the changes in policy. As we'll go into in more detail for each of these, the incentives include there are market and investor pressures. There are technology company, think Amazon and Meta and those sorts of companies that have made low carbon pledges. They're looking for low carbon power. There are state and regional momentum and activities that have been going on. Global markets are continuing to move in the world of carbon reduction. You also could be hedging risks by continuing activity in CCS. There is a factor of the competitive landscape. What businesses out there will have an advantage by continuing to pursue carbon capture or not? These are business decisions we'll talk about. And finally, there's reputation and social license to operate that are impacted by whether a company is pursuing a carbon reduction strategy. So let's look at these individual factors one by one. First, there are global capital markets are increasingly looking at the whole ESG, as they say, the acronym environment, safety, and governance, but environmental performance in this case. People like BlackRock, pension funds, and others, sovereign wealth funds, are encouraging companies to have a credible decarbonization plan in place. And so, for example, some pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and large institutions are integrating climate risk into investment criteria. And some large banks, Citi, HSBC, and others, actually have sectorial lending policies. Restricting financing in high carbon projects is a factor for some sources of capital funding, for example. Also, World Bank, International Finance Corporation, and others are increasingly requiring carbon accounting and low carbon alignment. So a failure to demonstrate progress on risks on CO2 capture, CO2 reduction, a failure to demonstrate something in this field could lead to a higher cost of capital as you lose access to certain investors, regardless of US policy shifts. These are happening on a global scale. So that's one issue to consider in terms of what is a driver for continued activity to reduce carbon. Let's consider now the tech company low carbon pledges. What we're noting is that the hyperscalers, as they call them, people like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, etc., have made low carbon pledges, and yet they're building these mega data centers that go through enormous amounts of electric power. And so they're under pressure and they have made pledges to reduce their carbon footprint. And the way to do that is with low carbon power. Remember again, the 45Q credits still exist. So if we look at the current administration, so we have here a push to use natural gas, and we have CCS incentives still existing in the form of the 45Q credits. A reflection of that then is that, as an example, a couple of examples, both Chevron and ExxonMobil are assessing huge gigawatt scale gas power projects that are tied to these data centers. ExxonMobil in particular, their announcement mentioned CCS would be a part of the planning criteria here, and Chevron is assessing whether carbon capture and storage makes a sense here, given the incentives that are in place. So you can see there's a business case here to be providing low carbon power, and one way to do that, at least, of course, is natural gas with CO2 capture. Another factor here is activities occurring at the state and regional uh, uh, environment in the United States, irrespective of US government action. We have US states like California with its low carbon fuel standard, North Dakota setting up storage hubs, as well as so is Wyoming, and Texas. And you're seeing CCUS projects on the Gulf Coast. These states are continuing to advance projects to reduce carbon emissions. And of course, there are regional policies and incentives, like California, for example, allows you to stack incentives like the 45Q carbon credit along with the low carbon fuel standard. These remain independent of federal policies. But there have been setbacks and advances, I might add. For example, North Dakota approved a pipeline from Iowa called the Summit Pipeline to move ethanol-based CO2 to storage in North Dakota. However, South Dakota has rejected that pipeline and discussions continue. On the other hand, just recently, the Tallgrass Trailblazer pipeline running from Nebraska ethanol plants to Wyoming for storage recently started up in September. So pluses and minuses there. Should point out that ExxonMobil is continuing to develop what they call the Rose CCS project near Houston, and EPA has approved draft Class 6 well permits. Well, there's the CalCapture project at the Elk Hills oil fields in California, which has received permits late last year to store CO2 captured from a cryogenic natural gas processing plant. There are plans in place also to add post-combustion capture to an existing 550 megawatt combined cycle power plant. So there are activities continuing at the state level that are taking advantage of these continuing incentives still in place for CO2 capture. If we consider global markets, the EU is planning to implement their carbon border adjustment mechanism next year. This will basically add a tariff to certain imported products that are not currently subject to carbon costs similar to the EU system. Currently in the EU, the average price this year for a European Union allowance is about 75 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. This border adjustment mechanism will apply to imports of cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen, all of which are, of course, very CO2 intensive. We can note that the Woodside-led blue ammonia project in Texas near Beaumont will be using the ExxonMobil storage project that we just mentioned for CO2, and that blue ammonia is aimed at the EU market. Here, Woodside is taking advantage of the fact that natural gas prices, the feedstock for ammonia, is much lower in the US than it is in Europe. And by doing the carbon removal bit, they can avoid having that tariff and have a competitive product for European export. Anyway, the first, as they say, non-blue production of ammonia is slated to start late this year as the project nears completion. And then they are planning to implement the CO2 capture portion of the operation as the ExxonMobil CO2 capture operation ramps up. Another factor is hedging risk. Well, what risk? Well, for example, for US operations, owners are faced with potential policy swings at the next administration, assuming there is a future administration. That's another topic. There is an advantage to companies developing CO2 capture expertise now. to avoid being caught unprepared if requirements tighten. So that at least encourages demonstrations. And as we've seen, there's a business case to be had for certain operations involving carbon capture that can take advantage of the 45Q. Also, early adoption of CO2 capture means you have lower future compliance costs, oddly, because you've been embarking on that experience curve where you gain an advantage in know-how, suppliers, partnerships, and lower costs as we build more and learn more. Also, getting engaged in CO2 capture sooner rather than later enables faster response to what might be new regulations or incentives that emerge not only in the United States, but perhaps on the international scene. If we look at the competitive landscape, yet another factor in considering lower carbon operations, we do have international competitors that are scaling up now in Norway, the Middle East, and Asia Pacific. By not acting, you could be falling behind and risking the loss of global market share in terms of low carbon fuels, LNG, and hydrogen, just as an example. So capturing CO2 is not just compliance in terms of a regulation that might be restricting emissions. It also could be part of a winning future energy market as, for example, regions like the EU implement these tariffs that account for carbon intensity of the imported product. Finally, another factor is reputation and social license. So energy companies and other companies that have CO2 emissions face ongoing community, customer, and NGO scrutiny. And companies with a visible strategy to deal with CO2 are enabled to retain a stronger brand reputation and perhaps win contracts with climate conscious buyers. For example, these tech companies that are looking for low carbon power for their data centers. In addition, you may improve employee retention by aligning with workforce values, I might add, and also enhance recruiting of today's students, many of whom are cognizant of the carbon intensive nature of our current system and the need to move to a low carbon future. So those are some of the drivers that might move one to go ahead and enable and carry out CO2 capture on operations. Well, let's look now at an example, specific example, where carbon capture and storage might provide a competitive lower cost in the current environment. And this is the case where we're looking at a driver for CCS in the production of low carbon electric power aimed at the hyperscalers, the Amazons and Metas that are paying a premium or are willing to pay a premium for low carbon power for their mega data centers since they have pledged to move to a low carbon footprint. Well, the reality is in the United States, the power grid is not green. For 24/7 operation, those electrons much of the day are simply not low carbon, meaning from renewable like solar, photovoltaic, or wind power. They don't operate 24/7. And in fact, true green power requires energy storage in order to be available 24/7. So let's see how this adds up. Is green power really cheaper as advertised by the proponents? And as we'll see, I would argue at present, no, it's not, if you need storage. Just as some background, current estimates from Lazard and updated recently for solar power cost with no investment tax credit, so backing that out. Without storage, the power cost can be $24 to around $100 per megawatt hour. And if you add as little as 4 hours storage, you double the lower end. And of course, there's uncertainty there, but basically you increase the cost of power even with 4 hours of storage, which you might add to take advantage of power that's needed in short-term bursts. But of course, it's not 24/7 coverage. Similarly for wind power, without storage, possibly a little cheaper than solar, but again, with 4 hours of storage, we see increased costs. But for truly green power 24/7, what we need for a minimum installed power capacity, if we look at a renewable resource, 1 over the capacity factor times the load is the absolute minimum we need to install. And we'll have a specific example of that to illustrate. Similarly, the minimum storage we require is 1 minus the capacity factor times the load times 24 hours. And that gives us the minimum storage required for 24-hour backup. And of course, we can have cloudy days and windless days that last more than 24 hours. So this is sort of a minimum cost look at storage required. And let's look at a simple-minded backup system for storage. Let's look at a solar system first. Consider a photovoltaic power system with a 25% capacity factor. That's a pretty good prolific solar location, say similar to Phoenix in the United States. And let's consider we want to put a 100 megawatt load on the grid. We want to supply 100 megawatts to the grid. Well, at 25% capacity factor, I would be generating 600 megawatt hours per day on average with my 100 megawatt system. However, what we desire is 24 hours of coverage. That's 2,400 megawatt hours. Bit of a gap there. And so if we install sufficient power to provide that, we've now added 300 megawatts, basically 75% capacity factor, if you will, each producing 600 megawatt hours per day. And we need 1,800 megawatt hours worth of battery storage to supply that 2,400 megawatt hours that we desire for a 100 megawatt load on 24/7. Again, this is the minimum extra power that you would have to install and batteries. The capital costs and operating and management and maintenance costs I've supplied here are from the National Renewable Energy Agency in the US, updated in around 2023. We can install batteries based on 60 megawatt packages, which is kind of the standard these days. They do come at a larger size, even 100 megawatts, but the difference in capital per kilowatt hour is inconsequential. So here's our capital cost for storage. In this case, $340 per kilowatt hour. So what does it add up to? I've made some simplifying assumptions here that the battery round trip efficiency is 100%. Of course, that's a quite attractive thought, but it's really typically more like 85%. And just as a particular case, we've looked at the photovoltaic and batteries in separate locations, but doesn't make much difference in terms of the cost. So with this storage, here's our total capital cost. The photovoltaic system is almost $500 million for the 400 megawatts installed. The storage is actually larger than that at about 600 million. So our total capital cost to put 100 megawatts on the system 24/7 with storage is almost $1 billion. Okay. So not inconsequential. This again is from US photovoltaic system studies from the National Renewable Energy Lab, updated in 2023. We can do a similar analysis with a wind system. Again, let's pick a nice large wind farm. This 200 megawatts would be a typical capacity of a wind farm. In this case, it would be 61 3.3 megawatt turbines. This is sort of current state of the art. And if we pick a capacity factor of 46.8%, which is a study that NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, did, I would have picked a more even number, but I'll use their numbers anyway. Lazard notes that the range of capacity factor for a wind power system is typically 38 to 55%. So again, as we've said, to put 200 megawatts on the grid, we desire 4,800 megawatt hours of power. So we can do that by, again, adding capacity another 230 megawatts of wind power, along with the batteries to back that up. And if we do the similar capital cost numbers from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the capital cost we had from batteries from the other study, because actually NREL did not examine storage for these wind cases, but we can use the same capital cost for batteries that we used on the wind power or on the solar power system. So again, total capital cost to put 200 megawatts on the grid with 24-hour backup is about $1.6 billion. In this case, the storage again outweighs the wind system, but it's close to 50-50. Interestingly, because the capacity factor is closer to 50-50. So those are two different systems, solar power and wind power, producing power. And the life cycle cost of electricity, which I skipped over, we'll look at a table now that gives us a comparison. Let's compare natural gas with CCS to photovoltaic and wind power, providing again 24/7 backup. Well, first off, adding capture to a natural gas combined cycle is not cheap. If we look at the base case here of a natural gas combined cycle system, and by the way, these costs for gas power and CO2 capture are from recent EPA, National Energy Technology Laboratory studies that updated the cost baseline costs for fossil energy in 2023. So these are recent costs. Basically, they estimate about $1,000 per kilowatt capital required for a state-of-the-art combined cycle power plant. If we add capture, you can see it about doubles the cost per net kilowatt to $2,200. If we look at the costs that for the photovoltaic and wind, again, we're putting 100 megawatts on the system, but require 400 megawatts installed. That's a capital cost of $10,000 and almost $11,000 per kilowatt net to put 100 megawatts on the grid. Wind is a bit better. Putting 200 megawatts on the grid, we need to install 430. Our capital cost is about $8,100 per net kilowatt hour, again, compared to the combined cycle with capture of $2,300. So you can see there's a factor of 4 or 5 difference in the capital cost between the renewable and the natural gas combined cycle with carbon capture. But let's get back to the cost of electricity. The cost of electricity for combined cycle with capture is estimated to be around $65 per megawatt hour life cycle cost. That's about a 50% premium on the base case, reference case of combined cycle without capture. And you can see this is quite competitive. The solar cost with capture or with storage is over $100 per megawatt hour, $110 per megawatt hour roughly. And for wind, it's a bit better at $75 per megawatt hour, but you can see the natural gas combined cycle at a fuel cost of $4.40 per million BTUs has an advantage over even wind power. And this is a real classic trade-off between capital cost and operating cost. You can see for the natural gas combined cycle with capture, our capital cost amounts to about a third of the cost of electricity, whereas capital cost utterly dominates the cost of photovoltaic and wind. And of course, that's the advantage, is the operating cost and maintenance is much lower. The fuel cost is the major factor for combined cycle plus capture. But in the near term, you can see that combined cycle with capture is much lower capital cost, especially if you're retrofitting a natural gas combined cycle power system, than adding the equivalent renewable plus storage. And keep in mind, these costs were for the absolute minimum required in terms of extra installed capacity and storage required to provide power 24/7. So that's your bottom line. In this particular instance, here's a business driving force that says, even in the current US policy environment, carbon capture may be a winner in terms of providing low carbon power to companies that have committed to reducing their carbon footprint and need to do so with low carbon electricity. So that's the business case of a particular example. So the CCS, really the argument here that we've made is that CCS is still relevant in the United States, even with the changes in policy. And of course, internationally, we've seen projects are going ahead as well. So the US policy shifts and CO2 capture incentives, basically, although the US government is rolling back regulations which limit greenhouse gas emissions, and in fact, downplaying climate risk to say the least. However, the tax credits for CO2 capture, such as 45Q and direct air capture, remain in place, which supports carbon capture and storage projects and may enable low carbon products to be exported, like, for example, the blue ammonia project going in on the Gulf Coast near Houston that Woodside is leading. So there are economic incentives there. And what I would argue is we've given you at least an example of many of the drivers for carbon capture and storage, that despite federal policy shifts in the United States, market forces, investor pressure, tech company low carbon pledges, state and regional policies, global market dynamics, risk hedging, the competitor landscape, and reputational concerns all provide incentives for the adoption of CCS in the United States, even with all of these changes. So that's your bottom line that we would argue, and happy to answer questions that you may
Well,
have.
Carl, pin your ears back because we have a few.
Okay, let's have some.
All right, okay. I've been having a discussion online with Jeffrey Baldwin, who's come
Right.
up with quite a few good questions. The last one he's got that I can't answer, but I know you can because this really
Oh
is your
dear.
bailiwick. What Jeffrey said was, years ago, I estimated the number of CO2 injector wells needed to remove a percentage of CO2 from the atmosphere to return CO2 to a 2010 level is crazy. I'm paraphrasing here, by the way.
Yeah.
The number of wells required to be converted or drilled was beyond possible, and the amount of CO2 needed to be injected for the same estimate was also beyond possible. You're concerned that these considerations are not being considered in the current work being done by the CO2 industry. I think, could you make a comment about direct air
Oh, sure.
capture and what your thoughts are?
Yeah, sure. So I do have some background in the storage side as well, but keep in mind I'm a surface engineer, so anything I say should be taken with a grain of salt. But concerning wells and the cost of storage, those costs are pretty well defined. Now you're right, especially most people think that the vast majority of storage in the end, if it happens at large scale, would be using deep saline aquifers. In the nearer term, we've got depleted oil and gas reservoirs that are also candidates for storage. And there, of course, you do have wells that are already in place that need to be assessed for robustness and longevity in terms of the corrosion characteristics of using them for CO2 injection. So those are all factors that need to be taken into account. And in general, the costs that are published, again, by people like the US Department of Energy before they quit working on this just a year ago, suggests that by far the major cost is CO2 capture. If you look at the end-to-end cost of CO2 capture and storage, typically 70% or more of the cost is the capture bit, and the remaining 30% is the transport and storage. And people have looked at, as you're correct, that the number of wells is a critical input to the cost of storage. But most of the saline aquifers that have been used for storage, and there are a number of projects that have happened at pretty large scale, 1 million tons per year or more. For example, the Snøhvit LNG project in Norway and others have demonstrated that you don't need a lot of wells. You just need to choose a geologic formation that has the appropriate porosity and connectivity to allow for injection. So I'm not sure if that wandered off point. Was that
It
the?
wandered off a little bit. I think what Jeffrey was really talking about was the number of wells you'd need to reduce using direct air capture
Right.
to
Well,
bring those levels down to maybe 200 ppm.
right. Yeah. And the necessity of direct air capture is, of course, a rousing debate these days, because current technologies that are being demonstrated are quite expensive for the capture piece, maybe a factor of 10 more costly than CO2 capture costs from, say, a natural gas combined cycle plant, which is considered a difficult case for CO2 capture because of the low CO2 concentration in the exhaust from a combustion turbine. It's typically 4% or so. And whether direct air capture is needed or not, the current thinking in the climate modeling community is yes, we've already or very nearly have exhausted what they call the carbon budget. That is, how much CO2 can we put into the atmosphere and not exceed 2 degrees centigrade. I guess current estimates are we're within only a year or two of exceeding that budget, and therefore some direct air capture will be required. And yes, it would be very large scale. But on the other hand, we know that continuing along the present path leads to enormous costs for an adaptation. And that's a big trade-off. I'd say that's a valid debate.
Oh, thanks, Carl. Oh, I think that answers the question quite well. I've got another one.
Well, it doesn't answer it definitively. Let's face it. It's an up in the air question. I acknowledge that. But in the case of direct air capture, the cost of the capture itself is likely to dwarf the storage costs.
Yeah. All right, we've got a question from Ida Sorensen. And this is a bit of an unusual one, but I think you can handle this one. How would the solar and wind cost look? What it would look like if nuclear power is used as the battery?
That's interesting. Well, of course, in effect, baseload power, whether it's nuclear or fossil with capture, let's say, if that's those two are enabled. Baseload power, the cost of power, of course, includes the cost of capital. And I think everybody out there knows that operating factor has a huge impact on the cost of your product. Very high operating factor spreads those capital costs over lots of unit of production. A very low operating factor means your cost of production is high. So it would be a trade-off. Nuclear power would be a fine source of low carbon baseline, but running it up and down would mean your capital cost requirements still have to be recovered. So it would be a balance. You're trading it off against the cost of storage for battery storage for wind and solar, and which ends up being the lowest cost option is an optimization I can't do in my head. But it's a valid question. You know, what's the trade-off? Can you install nuclear power and carbon capture and run it at a lower capacity factor? Is that still cheaper than battery backup? And that's an open question. And there's some question, the proponents of renewable power, and I'm not dissing renewable power, I think it's going to be in our future for sure. They keep pointing to the cost reductions in solar panels and windmills and battery power, and saying, well, look, eventually it's going to get to where it's so cheap you can have almost free electricity. Well, that ain't going to happen. And also, if you look at the rate of reduction of, let's say, solar panels and batteries, we're beginning to see the curve flattening out. How much lower can you really go if you need lithium and these other rare earths that are also costly? We're starting to run into raw material costs that are limiting how low you can go on the cost of producing some of these. So it's all in play, and I think valid discussion and going to be the subject of much discussion and optimization to figure out what the best balance is. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. All right, here's one. How do recent US policy shifts like the IRA or the methane rules actually translate into design or operational changes for energy facilities?
Well, that's I guess an open question. The current administration is looking to minimize these sorts of regulations and limitations, and how that plays out will likely play out somewhat in the legal system in terms of whether the existing rules, which do limit methane emissions and strongly encourage making really tight facilities to minimize emissions, will there be legal action to force the administration to continue to execute those or to enforce those rules, or will EPA get through the rule change procedures and eliminate those rules? That's an open question. I have no crystal ball on that one. But nominally, those rules were leading to much tighter standards in especially upstream oil and gas production and uses of natural gas to minimize leakage.
All right. Well, I think we're actually we've used up our hour. I've got several more questions in here. Then what we can do is we can send those questions out to everyone who's been on the webinar,
right?
With the answers. But thanks, Carl. Unless anyone has any more questions, I think we're going to close it out. And thank you very much for attending.
I guess I would make one comment. Jeffrey does note that using trees and agriculture, you can absorb CO2, and that's direct air capture. And in fact, there's a way of doing that, if you will, is more permanent. The issue with land management, of course, is you can have fires, and trees have a lifetime and they rot, and then the CO2 is put back in play. And so that makes problematic as to how stout CO2 capture by land use issues really are. But one way around that, which still involves CO2 storage, by the way, is using bioenergy to generate power, but capturing the CO2. So you're growing a biomass, absorbing CO2, generating power with it, but capturing the CO2, and in effect, that's indirect air capture. So people are working on that, but you still run into the land use issues that if you're growing massive amounts of biomass for power production and subsequent capture, is that infringing on food production? And there you go, another trade-off that we need to worry about. So interesting discussion, folks. Love the questions, and Ron and I will work on a coherent response more than I've been able to babble about recently.
All right, then. I think we're just about done for now. And again, thank you, everyone. And I think we're going to close out.
Cheers, everyone. Stay safe out there.
Thank you. Bye.